We are an organization devoted to the collegiality of writers everywhere in the world.
In 1922, in New York City, writers and editors formed PEN America, imagining that writers engaging writers globally could bridge the divide between nations and cultures.
To say that a new barbarism threatens is to say too much.
Hitler burnt books and used a phrase that's very interesting. He said, we have to get rid of the artistic criminal.
In Spain, fascists arrested journalist Arthur Koestler and executed poet Federico Garcia Lorca. In Germany, Nazis arrested, imprisoned, exiled, and murdered writers and intellectuals.
Barbarism is not an episode. It is a powerful thread running evil through history.
We work on the unspoken premise that the freedom to write is one of the inalienable rights of humankind. We are passionate about improving the liberty of writers everywhere.
PEN stands for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought, and members pledge themselves to oppose suppression of free expression around the world.
And the enemies of the imagination, politburos, ayatollahs, all the different goon squads of gods and power, want to shut these revolutions down and can't.
Behind the Iron Curtain, Václav Havel and dozens of other writers were imprisoned for writing and signing the Charter 77 Human Rights Manifesto. And in Nigeria, playwright Ken Saro-Wiwa was arrested, tortured, and hanged. In China, Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo was condemned to prison for 11 years for writing 7 sentences. And in Ukraine, filmmaker Oleg Sentsov criticized the Russian government and was sent to a Siberian prison camp.
A writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind. A writer's life and work are its necessity.
Over the past 100 years, PEN America has become an international force, advocating for free expression, defending writers and artists at risk around the globe, and fighting censorship here and abroad.
To be an artist, you must imagine and create and world build. And to be an activist, you must do the same, because an activist has to imagine a world that isn't there and make it so.
At PEN America, we are fighting for free expression in all its forms. Novels, nonfiction, poetry, dance, film, art, theater, cartoons, music, research, digital activism, journalism, and translations. Because creativity freely expressed transcends borders and drives our curiosity. It's how we share experiences, tell stories, and understand others. Free expression is the lifeblood of our freedom and humanity. It's what unites us.
For PEN as an organization, it should be heartening to realize that it turns out the pen is mightier than the sword. The stories we tell are powerful.
PEN America, championing the freedom to write for 100 years. With you, we're ready for the next century.
Okay, welcome. My name is Drew Menaker, and I'm PEN America's Chief Operating Officer. I want to thank you for joining us here this evening in New York City, and to welcome everyone who is tuning in virtually from coast to coast. So as writers, as translators, as editors, as publishing professionals, as others from the literary community, and as their readers and their allies, PEN America members are an important force in defense of free expression, the right to debate and dissent, the right to read, learn, and teach. And this is why membership in PEN America, the participation of each of you, is so important. If by chance you are not yet a member of PEN America, I hope you'll be sure to contact our membership team and also to find us online at pen.org/join. It's extremely important because when you join PEN America, you become part of a global force advocating for the freedom to write and to create. I'm just back from Ukraine, where our PEN America delegation stood in solidarity with our partners at PEN Ukraine. Together, we released a report on the use of cultural erasure as a tactic of war. The report detailed the destruction of Ukraine's museums, its theaters, its libraries, the persecution of writers and artists. These attacks on Ukrainian heritage expose the breadth of the attempts to wipe out Ukraine's cultural identity by the invading Russian forces and the Russian government. Being on the ground in Ukraine was illuminating, it was inspiring, and it was certainly sobering. We saw how writers and poets and artists and cultural workers are demonstrating incredible resilience and resistance in the face of this brutal conflict. And we also saw what their reality is, the fragility of their electrical infrastructure, the damage and destruction to their lives and livelihoods, their communities. At PEN Ukraine, at our partners there, they understood and profoundly appreciated that we came in the name of all the members and supporters of PEN America. They welcomed our delegation as representing a bridge of solidarity with all of you. It was incredibly important to them that they understood that they did not stand alone. So with that thought in mind, we're excited to have you here in New York, as well as members joining, as I mentioned, from around the country, including from our 10 chapters sprinkled across the United States. For those of you attending virtually, I hope you'll participate in the chat and in the discussion and submit questions. And let me just once again welcome you to our annual general meeting and our town hall, where each year we try to take on a timely and complex question. So now I'm pleased to introduce PEN America's president, the novelist and playwright Ayad Akhtar.
Hi, it's so good to be here and so good to have you here. Thank you for coming. In this PEN America's 100th year, we celebrated a century of PEN, 100 years of being committed to freedom of expression and love of literature as writers, as readers, 100 years of working together to find ways to make a mark beyond the marks we make on the pages at our desks and in our works. We celebrated our centenary in style this year, whether it was our authors symposium and exhibit at the New York Historical Society or Jenny Holzer's installation projecting words of literary freedom on the facade of Rockefeller Center, and of course Margaret Atwood blowtorching an unburnable version of The Handmaid's Tale, just to name a few of the highlights. But in this 100th year, we also found our mission reborn, and our fight for free expression as vital and essential as ever. I know that for me personally, as well as for the organization, the attack on our former president, Salman Rushdie, clarified even more profoundly the importance of what PEN stands for. As state legislatures and school boards work to ban books and place gag orders on education, we've become watchdogs tracking growing censorship in America today. We've sounded the alarm and will continue to sound the alarm about the lack of diversity in publishing, about disinformation and extremism in the news, about bullying online from the right and the left, and supporting the freedom of artists and scholars to pursue whatever subject they wish without qualification, or, as Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. put it in his gala speech last year, and I quote him here, "The idea that you have to look like the subject to master the subject was a prejudice that our forebears, women seeking to write about men, black people seeking to write about white writers, were forced to challenge. Toni Morrison's master's thesis at Cornell was a study of Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, completed in 1955, the same year that Rosa Parks refused to move from the white section of that public bus. Any teacher, any student, any reader, any writer, sufficiently motivated and committed, must be able to engage with the subjects of their choice freely and without pre-qualification. That is not only the essence of learning, ladies and gentlemen, that is the essence of being human." It would be remiss not to mention what stands out as perhaps the year's most significant global development, Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin is waging a war against the Ukrainian people, but also a war of cultural erasure. Grants to struggling Ukrainian artists and writers were one way we did what we could. Forming the new Penn Barbie Freedom to Write Center is another. We celebrate the written word because we, and you, us, understand its power. PEN America's members are the core of our organization, allowing our advocacy to flourish. So thank you for the support, your passion, your words. Thank you for an amazing year. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Suzanne Nossel, our CEO, for tonight's thrilling lineup. It's a discussion I know we're all here to hear. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you, Drew and Ayad, for that introduction. And I'm delighted to introduce our panel discussion. Do publishers have a moral obligation to diversify American literature? And this is a long-standing conversation, one that in my nearly 10 years at PEN America has been alive and a point of consternation for the industry and for writers, I'd say that whole time. At PEN America, we issued a report this fall called Reading Between the Lines, an examination of what is holding publishing back, why publishing hasn't made more progress. That project was germinated in the summer of 2020 as publishing and the rest of our society went through an awakening on issues of racial justice. And so we wanted to explore the themes of this report and promote the report and the ideas and the conversation that we hope it sparks. So we're really delighted to have all of you here tonight to help us do that. And I will introduce our panel. I will ask some questions, and then we will open it up for questions and discussions with all of you. So looking forward to that. I want to introduce our panel. I'm going to start, I'll start on the far end with Roxane Gay, an author and cultural critic whose work garners international acclaim for its reflective, no-holds-barred exploration of feminism and social criticism. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times and co-editor of Pank, and previously the nonfiction editor at The Rumpus, and also leads Roxane Gay Books at Grove Atlantic Publisher, and has a new prestigious appointment at Rutgers University. Christopher Beha is the author of a memoir, The Whole 5 Feet, and the novels Arts and Entertainment and What Happened to Sophie Wilder. His latest novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, was nominated for the 2020 National Book Award. He's the editor of Harper's Magazine and is currently writing an intellectual history of atheism. Min-Jun Lee is an author whose work has been acclaimed across the country and globally. Her debut novel, Free Food for Millionaires, was a #1 book sense pick, a New York Times Editor's Choice, Wall Street Journal Book Club selection, and much more. Her second novel, Pachinko, was a 2017 National Book Award finalist and is now a hit television show. And then finally, Errol McDonald is Vice President and Executive Editor of Knopf Doubleday, a division of Penguin Random House, and has worked in various editorial capacities there for more than 3 decades. Among the distinguished authors he has published are James Baldwin, Count Basie, Italo Calvino, Henry Louis Gates, Kazuo Ishiguro, Fran Lebowitz, Toni Morrison, Salman Rushdie, and Wole Soyinka. He's been a lecturer at Yale College and an adjunct professor at Columbia, and he joined the PEN America Board in 2012, serving several terms with distinction with us. So delighted to have all of you here, and I'm going to start with you, Chris, because you have made the point that as we commence a discussion on this topic, we need to be clear about what we're talking about, and particularly what we mean when we talk about publishing, whether we're talking about sort of books writ large, or rather the more rarefied domain of literature, or specifically the literary canon. And I'm wondering if you can unpack that. Does diversity and representation matter in both realms, but for different reasons? And what are those reasons?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the panel. I suppose the point I was trying to make, I read the report with great interest and was depressed by a lot of what I found there, as I know a lot of people were. But it's mostly a report about Big Five publishing. And what happens in Big Five publishing matters a lot. It's an enormous industry with revenue in the $20 to $30 billion a year range. It's an employer of thousands of people. It produces most of the books that get published in this country. And if the leadership and rank and file employees and books published and by all these metrics, if the industry is 90+% white, that's a disaster. So I think the answer is pretty simple on that front. If the question is, does publishing have an obligation to diversify itself? I think we would all agree on that. But without getting too hung up on the phrasing of the question that was asked is, does publishing have a moral obligation to diversify American literature? And that presumes that what happens in American literature is up to Big Five publishing. And I don't think that's the case, and I don't think it should be the case. I don't think those of us who care about American literature should want Big Five publishing to be the custodians of American literature. I don't think they have proven to be very good in that role historically. So that seems like maybe missing the point, but I think it's important because I do think there are issues of diversity in this industry that are in many ways similar to the issues across all sorts of industries that have come up since the summer of 2020. Publishing may be lagging behind other industries. There may be particular things about the industry that need to get addressed. But those questions, to me, I work for an independent magazine. Most of my work has been published by independent publishers. What happens in the publishing industry writ large is less important to me personally than what happens within the literary community and the literary culture, which also, by the way, needs to diversify itself. But I think it's just a more complicated question, how that happens and what that means. So that's the distinction I sort of wanted to draw at the beginning of the conversation.
Are you saying, just for clarity, are you saying publishing, Big Five publishing, does not control the bulk of the sort of literary canon or what we think of as literature, or that they should not?
Well, I think, first of all, as Errol said when we were discussing this earlier, if you just look at the numbers, 90+% of what the publishing industry puts out every year is not literature. That's not in a value judgment way. That's just, it's books that would not be categorized in a bookstore as literature. Then even the trade fiction that it puts out and the literary nonfiction that it puts out, most of it, if you are going to start making value judgments, I would say is not written with serious literary intent. It does not meet the standards that I for one, I'm not pretending that I get to be the arbiter of what is or is not literature, but in any given year, if I look at the books that came out that I think are most likely to last, that have the most impact on me, that I get the most excited about, that speak to me as someone who has my entire life wanted to be engaged in this project, they're coming out from one or two Big Five imprints, and then a whole bunch of small presses that are doing really heroic work.
Great. Okay. Roxanne, I want to turn to you. And I was reading a Gordian profile of you, and you commented on this very topic. They just a quote from it said, "She reserves a particular ire for those who read only literary fiction." Anybody who tells me I only read literary fiction, I'm just like, well, you're an asshole. What are we going to talk about? Literary fiction? A lot of it's not that good. I read good books. They may not be the best written, but they tell a really good story. So I'm curious how you see this question of are we sort of defining the canon in the wrong way? Is diversification of literature or the literary canon partly about redefining what is in that category?
I think that we can have all kinds of conversations about genre and those distinctions and if they do or do not matter. I think the issue of diversification is one that spans all genres and all types of books, and that it's not relevant, really, the distinction is not relevant in terms of diversifying, because from university presses to small presses to independent presses to regional presses to the big five, diversity is a massive issue. It's not any better in any realm. And I think when we try to tell ourselves that independent presses are somehow leading the way, we're deluding ourselves. I think independent presses are doing critical work, heroic, as Chris said, but they are dealing with the exact same diversity issues that the big five are dealing with. You know, I think that ultimately the question we're asking, does publishing have a moral obligation? It's not even the right question, because it's a business, and businesses don't have morals, and they can't because they're not people. The real question is, why are we still having these conversations asking should, when we already know that they should, and instead we should be asking how do we diversify? And actually we have those answers. The report reflects those answers very well, and it's really about having a financial imperative to create change, paying people more so it's not just people with trust funds or hedge fund husbands who can work in publishing. It's about allowing for remote work. It's about changing who is running publishing companies so that it's not just white men and a few white women at the very top. And so we know this. It's not rocket science. I mean, truly, it's super, super simple, but publishing simply does not want to make those changes. And that's, I feel some kind of way about that, but, I think, let's talk about that, and let's talk about how we hold publishing's feet to the fire and force change once and for all so that, the next generation of writers, especially Black writers and writers of color in general, don't have to sit on these panels and talk about diversity when we would probably rather be talking about our craft.
So, Errol, you've made the point that when discussions of representation in book publishing tend to focus on acquisition of books, whose books are bought and signed, who's making those decisions, whereas you think a crucial piece of the puzzle has to do with the end user, the consumer, who is how we shape the universe of book buyers. Can you explain why you think that's a crucial piece, and if you think it's been overlooked, why it's been overlooked?
Sure. I've been at this game for not more than 30 years, but exactly 45 years.
Who's counting?
And I've never known publishers not to want to diversify, okay? And I've always seen that as an exercise in bad faith, because let's not mince words. Book publishing is a white supremacist industry, okay? And by white supremacist, I mean it caters to a consumer who is interested in a certain end product. So we can focus all we want on the gatekeeping, on editorial, but more often than not, that effort will simply reinforce the issue because those books will not sell, okay? And as a result of not selling, they increase demand for the product that was always in demand, okay? I think that publishers have been not courageous in focusing on that space between themselves and buyers, because that's where, for me, the action is. That's where publishers need to invest in creating a superstructure that can support what it is that the diversity that they're talking about, okay? If they're not interacting with Amazon or Barnes & Noble in a way that advances diversity, then I think the game is over.
So when you talk about buyers, you're talking about wholesale, about booksellers.
Yes, because, I don't see an Amazon algorithm that is interested in diversity. I see Amazon talking about books like this, or books you might be interested in, but it is not advancing the program per se, nor is Barnes & Noble for that matter. Lip service is given to this issue of diversity, but at the end of the day, it's Americans in America today, as divisive as the culture is, who are responsible for whether publishing can diversify or not. Okay? Because it's they who create demand.
All right, I want to come back to that, but I want to go to you, Min, first, because you have talked about this very issue of, as a writer, the idea that a writer needs to activate an audience and kind of find and stimulate an audience. And I'd like to hear about how you've done that and how you conceive of the role of the writer in kindling demand for their work and interest in their work when it may not be something that people have been exposed to before or that they're necessarily seeking out.
Well, I have a tremendous fear of poverty. So that helps. I have the anxiety of an immigrant. That helps. And I remember when my first book was sold after 11 years of trial and tribulation and much humiliation. So it took me a very, very long time to publish my first novel. And finally, when I got published, I remember I hired somebody to build a website. And back then, it wasn't so easy to build a website. You had to hire somebody who knew what they were doing. And it cost, I don't know, something like $2,500, which is a lot of money for me. Back then, it's still a lot of money for the average writer. And I told another writer that I was going to do this. This is 2006. And I remember the other author who I really respect, and she writes gorgeous books, and she said, "Why in the world would you have a website? Why do you need that?" And I remember feeling like the shame of the outsider, the shame and the anxiety and the desperation of a poor person thinking, oh, I'm not doing it right. Like, I've clearly offended somebody by the way I'm approaching marketing, like this dirty word. And then I did it anyway because it seemed to me that I was 38 years old and I had once been a corporate attorney for 2 years. So it wasn't like I wasn't aware of how companies do things. So I thought, well, it's probably good to have a central place to have all of my information. That's all I was really thinking. It wasn't a very fancy website, didn't have bells and whistles. And then I remember going to, my book publisher, Hachette, sent me on a very, very tiny book tour. But I was so excited. And they put me in something called media training, which I needed because I overshare and I cry too much. And it was one day, it was like 2 hours, whatever the company paid for, they got their money's worth because I'm a really good student and she had written a book. So I figured, well, 2 hours is probably not going to be enough for me to change my personality. So I'm going to read this book. So I read this book, and it was all about audience and how to deal with audience. And I was like, okay, I read the book, I had the media training, I have the book tour, I'm going to go. And I go to this bookstore, and there's nobody there. And all I could think was, I failed, like, my publisher, my agent, my ancestors, just like everybody, and it was so mortifying. But this is the normal story, if you're lucky enough to get a book tour. And Ann Patchett once said to me, I'm flexing there with a little name drop. She said, the only thing worse than a book tour is not having a book tour. And all the authors are like, amen. So that was from Ann Patchett. It's not for me, so please give her credit. So I decided, I think I need to do this thing called social media. And I didn't want to because I'm a very, very private person. And the fact that I'm here today is really hard. Whenever I'm in public, it's because I think it's very important. This topic is very important. And I'm always trying to help authors to try to get more attention for their work because it's so hard to break out. And when you're an outsider and you don't have friends and you don't have connections, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. So I got myself a website, I went on social media, and I try to weigh in on things only that matters. So all those things happen. But then I'm going to tell you a story, a very quick story of, I went to my first fancy book party. And for those of you who are authors, if you get invited to a fancy book party, it's very exciting because you're thinking, somewhere out there there's a fancy book party in which I was never included to. This is it. So I went to the thing, and I was with another author who was just a wonderful, wonderful, generous writer, and she said to this person that I was introduced to, who's published by a Penguin Random House, I think it was Knopf. And she said, oh, this is Min Jin Lee, her book is coming out, and the other author kind of like peered in and said, oh, who's your publisher? And I said, it's Grand Central at Hachette. And they looked at me, and they're like, and they walked away. Because my publisher had not passed muster. And it was interesting to me because I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know there was a status ranking with publishers. I didn't know that imprints had their own personality. I didn't know that I would or would not get reviewed by any of these things depending upon the association. And now I realize that he's an asshole and that he's wrong. But at the moment, all I could feel was this like withering sense of shame about everything. And the reason why I share this story is because this is what it's like to be an outsider in an industry in which I had bet my life on. I walked away from being a lawyer to be a writer and to write books that I wanted to write that were true and important to me. And nobody said, oh, go write a book about the Korean Japanese people for 100 years. And I wrote both of my books without an agent, without a contract. So I wrote both of my novels on spec, which means that I'm a very foolish person. That said, I'm 54 years old. I've written 2 books that really take a long time to write. My next book is so behind. I shouldn't be here. I should be typing. But all I'm saying this to you is that when I tell my stories about publishing, I'm telling you what it's like to be on the outside, to write about things that nobody asked me to write, but I thought were so important. And I'm out there, to answer Suzanne's question, trying to explain myself because I don't trust that anybody else is going to explain me. And I think that is the burden of being an outside writer. I think that when you have a white supremacist, heterosexist publishing industry that's homophobic, that's really deeply sexist in so many ways and patriarchal, and then you try to go and say like, oh, by the way, I have this story. And thankfully, I can talk about Aristotle, so you can't make me feel bad when you're a gatekeeper. There are all these things that I have trained myself in order to be exceptional, and I think that burden of trying to be exceptional is so, so unfair. And I guess that's my 2 cents, and I will, there you go, so website,
social media. So, I mean, what's interesting about all of your input is the question, where really is the point of leverage in this system? Roxanne is saying, it's these big publishers, and they just, they won't do it, and we have to force them to do it. Chris, you're talking about smaller presses. Errol, you're talking about the booksellers as sort of the, unless they change the algorithms at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, these works are not going to break through. Min, you're talking about the role of the author and the reader. And you're alluding to that too, that Errol, that it's about ultimately Americans and what they are open to buying and reading. And I guess what's striking to me is this is such an old conversation, and yet do we even understand as between all of those levers? Or is it just kind of like you have to pull on all of them? Is there one that is the key? Or are we still as confused about that as they were? I remember, Errol, in your piece, I Am Not Your BIPOC, you sort of talk about this debate going back to 1980, 42 years ago. Have we advanced in our understanding, and what do we know about these different levers? And I'll open that to any of you.
What we know is that publishers need to start incentivizing its publicity, marketing, and sales departments to advance the cause of diversity in books, okay? If my bonus is dependent on selling as many copies of books that I've heretofore sold, what's in it for me? And I think that publishers need to start investing in an infrastructure that advances. Publishers need to do what they said they were going to do after the murder of George Floyd. And they have failed miserably, with the exception of certain token appointments.
I just want to add that I think it's possible that we are all talking about different sides of the same thing, you know, because obviously, you know, everybody needs to be participating in the solution. And I want to say in particular that I think I am almost entirely in agreement with Roxanne. I didn't mean to be saying that small presses were in a better place than the Big Five was, but I did mean to be saying that in many ways the kinds of pressure that needs to be brought on the Big Five, precisely because they are these enormous profit-generating institutions, are the same sorts of pressures that need to be brought to bear on industries throughout society. And I think in certain ways that when it comes to the big publishers, the question isn't, there aren't a lot of issues that are particular to literature, quote unquote. You know, I know that most editors I know and publicists I know and people who work for companies like this one care a lot about literature and care about books, and they're in this industry for a reason. But I think that the ultimate decision makers are, you know, I won't say that they could just as easily be selling widgets, but I think there's something to that. You know, they're making decisions at a very high sort of abstracted corporate level. And I agree with Roxanne that it doesn't, you can't make quote unquote moral demands on people who are making those kinds of decisions. You have to apply pressure, and you have to apply financial pressure, you know. But I think that some of the small presses are essentially, you know, single person shops or something like that, where you do have people who are driven by a sense of mission doing this, and you have people who are, you know, could be making a lot more money doing something else, and they're doing it out of a sense of an obligation to a literary community. And, you know, an example that I was speaking a little bit with Errol about before we got in here is a writer named Leon Forrest, who some people may be familiar with. I was not familiar with his work until it was brought to me by a man named Jeff Deutsch, who runs the Seminary Co-op bookstore in Chicago. But Leon Forrest was one of Toni Morrison's writers at Random House. He published his first 3 books with her, and then finished in the early 90s a book called Divine Days. It's 1,100 pages. It is a sort of modernist novel that is attempting to do for 20th century, mid-20th century Chicago, particularly 20th century Black Chicago, what Joyce did for Dublin. And it was not published by Random House or by a big press, perhaps because Toni Morrison had moved on from publishing by then, perhaps because it was an 1,100-page modernist text, perhaps because his earlier books had not sold that well. I don't know the details, but what I do know is that it was published by a university press, and it sank without a trace. And Leon Forrest died a couple of years later, and all of his books are now out of print. And, you know, basically a couple of people in Chicago have essentially started an imprint, which they're working with, I believe it's Northwestern University Press, with to reissue this book. And there's no way this book sells tens of thousands of copies, you know. It doesn't have that kind of audience, but to me it doesn't have to have that kind of potential audience in order to be significant. And to me, if it becomes a book that is important to a handful of writers who then go on to do important stuff, it has an opportunity, and I'm only 100 pages into it, but I really love it, and it has an opportunity to get itself into the canon, and he seems to me like a writer who belongs in the canon. So that is one of the most exciting things to me that is going on in publishing right now, is the work that small presses are doing to rediscover writers. The work that a press like New York Review Books does. The work that a press like New Directions does. The fact that now Clarice Lispector is understood to be a great canonical writer, and 15 years ago that was not really the case for a lot of people. So that's one of the ways you diversify the canon. But that is not work that profit-driven publishers are ever going to do, and there's just no getting around that. And that's why, to me, I think, not to keep harping on this point, but I just think those of us who care about literary culture, I do not think we want the big five publishers to be the custodians of that culture.
I want to get back to this question of morality, because I had the same reaction that I think some of you had when I first saw this proposed title for the panel, which is like, morality. Like, does morality even come into this? And I guess my question is, if the commercial imperative is not there, what else is there other than morality as a driver and a mobilizer and an appeal? Or is there something missing in how we're assessing and how publishers are assessing the commercial equation? Or are they just sort of bad business people that they haven't been able to unlock a big market opportunity? Or is the market opportunity what it is, and yet there's a larger imperative that derives from somewhere else? And is that place not morality?
Well, I think when you say morality, it makes it seem like diversifying publishing is like taking your medicine. Like, oh, here, let's throw some books by writers of color or trans writers or writers with disabilities. Like let's throw them a bone because it's the right thing to do. Instead of there are excellent books that are being written by these authors and they are not getting the attention and the resources that they deserve. And so the answer is actually kind of simple, which is just publish excellent books and maybe don't overpay for them. I think that the trial with for Penguin Random House, the antitrust trial, was very eye-opening. I think a lot of us who have been writers for a while understood that the economics are completely out of whack. But, maybe stop paying people $600,000 for a book that's going to sell 1,300 copies. It's just a place to start. I think that there's a happy medium between a very small advance and a very outrageous advance. And so if we were to just rethink our priorities and stop sort of allocating marketing dollars based on advances, and, just logistical things, and remembering that when we say publish diversely, we're not saying that you need to check off a box. It's that you need to understand that excellence is everywhere.
Carol, is that the answer? Or
Well,
is it...
I agree in part with what Roxanne said, but, morality in publishing has a way of devolving into condescension. And by that I mean, so many publishers nowadays feel it is their moral duty to diversify their lists, but to no effect, okay? And I believe that they think that they're indulging in some form of noblesse oblige, which is ultimately condescending. Okay? So, especially in an industry where the overwhelming majority of product has nothing to do with morality. So I am not sure why books that are supposed to diversify a list should be subject to that category. I want to say one more thing about canon formation, this notion of publishers as being instrumental in forming the canon. We should recall that canon formation historically has been an exclusionary activity. It refers to biblical literature, excluding certain books from inclusion in the Bible, okay? And the idea of publishers engaging in canon formation is, for me, a terrifying prospect, especially given what is produced nowadays.
So should there be no canon, or should the canon be formed in a different way?
The canon evolves. If you think of just about any so-called canonical writer, be it Toni Morrison, Cormac McCarthy, William Faulkner, okay? When Faulkner published Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, Sanctuary, Light in August, Absalom, Absalom, Americans yawned with lack of interest. Nobody was reading Faulkner until 1945 when Malcolm Cowley issued The Portable Faulkner, excerpts from Faulkner's books that people started reading and saying, yeah, he's pretty good. Nobody was reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian sold fewer than 1,000 copies when it was published. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye sold fewer than 1,500 copies. So this notion of publishers being in charge of canon formation seems to me to be missing the point. Canons evolve, especially nowadays, as a result of cultural pressure.
But if I can just jump in on one thing.
Yeah, sure.
All of those writers you mentioned continue to get published.
All of them continue to get published, but every single one of them has diminishing sales.
But no, sorry. They continued to get published over the course of their careers. You could put out a book that sold 1,000 copies, and there would be a buyer for your next book, right? I will just say from my own experience, because Min brought up her experience, right? I wrote a book that was published by a small press. It did well by small press standards. My next book was bought by a Big 5 imprint. Okay, it did not do well by their standards. I then wrote on spec for 7 years, my next novel. Every single Big 5 imprint turned it down. 7 years of work was bought by an independent press for $7,000. And that is because my Big 5 imprint no longer wanted to publish me because they hadn't succeeded on a single book. As soon as they didn't want it, anyone else is just going to look at the book scan, and they're going to say, I'm not paying money for this book. And that's, I'm not for a second trying to say, just saying that to say some sort of like, it happens to straight white guys too. That's not my point. I'm just saying been a fundamental change in publishing that has to do with whether or not you get to publish another book if a book you write sells 1,000 copies. And because the Big 5 didn't exist as such, but Cormac McCarthy kept getting published by what we would consider as mainstream commercial house.
Well, it gets to one of the issues that was a bit of a struggle for us in writing this report, which is that so much of what kind of leaves writers left hamstrung is just sort of the fundamentals of the industry that affect everybody, but have a kind of more pronounced impact on writers of color and writers who don't come from traditional backgrounds. So whether it's sort of the low pay or limited marketing and publicity investment that seems totally inadequate to launch a book, low advances, all of that is sort of common to everybody. And most writers, and most books don't do well, right? And most people can't get a book contract, can't get even an agent. And so I guess, one thing we struggled with is how to discern, and we tried to do it in the report, and I hope we succeeded, to try to discern, what is the layer that really is specific to writers of color to people who, from backgrounds that have not traditionally been represented.
If I can just jump in
yeah.
and say one more thing about what I just said, so it doesn't seem like I'm completely obtuse about this. I will add that I come from a comfortable upper middle class background, and I was, for all sorts of reasons, in a position after having sold this book that didn't sell well, in a position to organize my life in such a way that I could write the next book over the next 7 years. Part of that was I had a full-time job and I was balancing, but I'm extraordinarily aware of the fact that a lot of people who do not have the privileges that I have, that book doesn't work, and that's it. They cannot organize their lives in such a way that they can then write the next book if they don't have a publisher to back them. So I will say that is absolutely, I think, a much more acute problem for writers, regardless of racial or ethnic background, who are just coming from places that were less privileged than my own.
Well, I guess I kind of think,
yeah,
I mean, I'm going to say something really strange, which is that, first of all, if you took everything away and made a generalization about writers, like all writers, we're not that normal, right? So then if you add the intersectional aspects of our lives, whether it's your religion or whether it's your gender or sexual identity, your poverty, your education background, your parents, your family, and then you add all the stressors, the institutional stressors of publication, which is so difficult. But people who want to be writers, you can't be that normal. Because we know it's hard. I mean, it's always been hard for writers. Always. And it's always been a bit of a silver spoon kind of activity. Because even if you were back then, you needed to. And this comes from a very, very long training on my part of reading the classics. I mean, writers have always had a hard time. So I know that. But now this is kind of cool because we are trying to have outsiders, traditional outsiders, like women, be considered writers. You know that like half the group, they want to be writers too. And so it's only a recent phenomenon. Even if you were a white straight woman from an upper middle class background, to be a writer wasn't easy or to be taken seriously. And then now you have all these other groups, parts of groups that I'm a member of. And I think that all those complications make being a writer really difficult. And I think that sometimes, this is very analogous to the next book that I'm working on about education, because education and institutions are also having the same issue of how do we create this utopia. This is really what we're talking about. This is utopia building, which is of course foundational with morality. Because you can't build a utopia unless you have a sense of mission of this is what my utopia looks like. My utopia may be different than Errol's utopia, may be different than Suzanne's utopia, because we're going to have a different idea. That said, the people that you want to bring into your community, how do you pick them, right? And how do you encourage them? How do you keep them going? And that's a really hard question. And I'm going to say something really nasty, but publishing is really hard because you need to have people like agents. It's hard to get an agent. And, we've actually said a couple of things, and maybe you guys all know because you may be members of PEN, and so you're more sophisticated. But for an outsider, you don't even know that, your advance often does determining marketing dollars. So if you were given $5,000 for your book, no one's going to pay attention to that book. It's not going to get reviewed. It'll be a miracle if that happens. I mean, a true holiday miracle, and I wish it for you. I mean, you could win a contest and still may not get reviewed. And people have said to me, oh, how did, I've never gotten reviewed by the New York Times. I'm like, yeah, I want you to do the math on this. If the New York Times only reviews, let's say, 4 or 5 novels per week, multiply that by 52, and then compare it against how many books are published per year that are novels. Good luck, right? And I think that it's the same thing with colleges. When people talk about, how do you get into school X and how do we diversify, I think, just look at the numbers. And then the most depressing thing about this frickin' report, and you guys should read this because it's crazy, this report. It's really good, but it's crazy. It's most Americans are reading 1 book, maybe, a year. Maybe. So why aren't we engaging not those same one-book readers, but why aren't we developing new markets? So when I see publishers, I'm thinking, you know where you guys are really fucking up? You need to get more readers. You need to go outside of your comfort zone and get those readers. And when people talk about book talk, like I haven't gone to TikTok yet because I'm 54 and I'm tired. But apparently, like, that's where kids are saying, like, oh, if this book makes you cry, then I'm going to buy this book. Apparently, those books are doing really great. I don't know exactly how that works. But I just want you to know that I think where publishers really, really fail is going to the exact same customer over and over and over again. Because I have been in situations in bookstores where people come to me and go, I've never been to a reading before. Ever. Like, they didn't think those bookstores were for them. Right? And I'm thinking, well, you know whose fault that is? That's the publisher's fault. It is. And maybe even the bookseller's fault. And I'm so behind booksellers. Like, those are my people. But I was explaining this to Suzanne in our previous Zoom call when we were preparing for this panel. I'm what you call, in economic terms, a B2C. I'm technically the business. And C is the consumer, and that's the reader. And I really care about my readers because I'm a reader. Like, I'm more of a reader than a writer. I've produced 2 books, think about it. Like, I'm really a reader. And that's fine because I respect myself and I respect my community. And if we're not reaching new readers, then I think that's where really the big problem is. So all the problems that we've discussed today are true. Like, there is a problem with advances. There is a problem with publishing too many books that aren't that good. I've judged the Pulitzer, I've judged the National Book Award, I've judged the Kirkus Prize, I've judged every frickin' fellowship made to man because I've become that girl who they call. And I'm really afraid sometimes that if I don't say yes, that other Asian Americans will not be asked. Seriously, I'm tired. And I'm always trying to increase other Asian Americans and other Asians, and Asian Americans a gigantic tent. I'm trying to bring more of us in because we need to have more people saying, like, I agree or disagree. And by the way, it's not monolithic. Like, not all people of color and not all gays, they're not all liberal. Like, there's so many different kinds of us, and we need to have so many of us in there that we have a critical mass, and then you're gonna have different opinions, and that's really important. So I think tokenization is something that I really, really rail against, and I also really rail against internalized racism and sexism and heterosexism, because I have seen so many people in my own community say nonsense. And I go, well, you know, I disagree with that, but I'm so glad they're in the room, right? Because then you guys will know there's different kinds of us.
I want to come back to tokenism, but before that, I want to just drill a little deeper on this question of connecting with other readers and activating and motivating and mobilizing other readers. And, you know, one of the points that we make in the report, it's not original, but is, you know, the New York Times holds this preeminence as sort of the hit maker or breaker of the industry, and an outsized importance and emphasis in marketing and in publicity. And I wonder, Errol, from you, you know, as the one person up here who works in publishing, you know, is there, you know, you talked a few minutes ago about the need to incentivize publicity, marketing, and sales. Like, what should they exactly be doing differently that would get readers or potential readers who are not coming into the bookstore, who are not coming to the reading, who are not taking an interest to maybe do so for the first time?
Well, insofar as publicity is concerned, perhaps find out where those readers are and what newspapers and magazines they're likely to read, what neighborhoods they live in. I mean, all of this is localized, should be localized, as opposed to doing that for which there is no competitive advantage, which is going on social media, essentially. And you know, I've had books. For instance, we once published a biography of Michelle Obama, which one would imagine readers might be interested in. Okay, but alas, we had to farm it out to a black publicist because we did not have the wherewithal to reach potential readers for that book, okay? And that is the kind of thinking that I think is problematic throughout the industry, which is that publishing, for the most part, lacks the infrastructure to publicize, market, and sell certain books. But I want to contextualize this question, I want to contextualize issues that we've all of us been talking about, which is that it might be useful to think of publishing as being akin to the pharmaceutical industry, which is that every book, every author is a research and development project, okay? And what you're looking for if you're a publisher is Viagra, okay? Always, that's what you're looking for,
Opioids,
a drug
maybe.
or opioids, or something that, but you're looking for a drug that will appeal to the broadest segment of sick people. Yeah. And I'll give you an example in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry was doing research on hypertension in black people. The drug they gave to black patients resulted in hirsuteness. People started growing hair all over their body. That's how minoxidil, a drug for bald people, became so widespread. Okay? So publishers are interested in mass. Okay? They're interested in research and development projects that will result in big brands. And that is why writers, say, of color, as this poor guy who was hypertensive, don't get the attention they deserve, if only because it is assumed that books pegged to a certain demographic can sell only but so many copies. Okay? And so the imperatives of capitalism win out, always.
What about the demographic pegging, though? Like, one thing was on my mind as we embarked on this report was I had a brief stint, believe it or not, in the music industry early in my career. And, there's like all this discussion, these crossover artists, artists who began, they were Spanish, they sang in Spanish, but then they reached an English audience, like J-Lo, and Gloria Estefan, they became huge, or, even years before B.B. King, originating in R&B, and then, becoming very mainstream. And, you have a lot of, all kinds of discrimination and exploitation in the music industry. You also have a lot of leaders of color, prominent, powerful recording executives. I mean, the industry has serious issues, but it just sort of looks very different than publishing. And I wondered, as I thought about it, I never could find an answer in terms of whether there was any analogy to be drawn, any fundamental distinction that explained why things, the two industries seem to develop so differently in this regard. But I'm curious, is there anything to be learned there?
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned there. So in 2017, when my book came out, I was really worried about my finances because we had several shocks in our family economy. I needed health insurance, we needed more money, our son was going to college. And I remember when the book came out, I was told that I would have to sell X number of books to earn out. And the number just seemed so hilarious to me. And I thought, okay, and I told all my friends. I said, okay, I somehow have to sell like a lot of copies. And I don't know how because nobody buys hardcovers anymore. And I did this thing, and I'm going to make you guys faint. But I went to every single book club that asked me in New York because I believed in my book. I really, really believed in my book. And I said, okay, I will get on the subway and I will go to your house and I will talk to your friends as they pass white wine or rosé, and some places champagne. And I will sit there and I will behave and I will talk about my book and I will answer dumbass questions sometimes. But for the most part, the readers were pretty nice. I have done over 1,000 events. And the analogy with music industry is basically I went on the road. I got on the bus. And there were times when it was a financial decision for me because I wasn't getting paid at that moment. I wasn't getting paid to speak. Like I was just going, and the promise was if you bought 15 hardcover copies, I would be there. And if a law firm asked me to do it, I would say, if you guys promise to buy 50 hardcover books, I will be there. And I did it, and it was really hard because I wasn't making money at that point. But I thought that if someone reads the book and actually reads, 490 pages of a historical novel of a Korean-Japanese family, then I believe that you might pass it along. And that's a whole term in publishing, the pass-along factor. And somehow I said, okay, if you finish the book and you like it, you're going to tell somebody else. So then I went on the road. And it actually did work, but I never hit the New York Times bestseller list. So the book came out in February for Pachinko. And Free for Millionaires never hit the bestseller. It did very well, and it's still actually selling. But in November, I was a National Book Award finalist, and I needed a job. And I went to a job interview, and it was a horror show. I just recently talked about it in Debbie Millman's podcast because that woman was so mean to me. And I had to have vengeance. But I didn't name any names.
Send around the episode after the panel.
But I didn't name any names. But my point was that my books weren't selling as well. It was still kind of like I was pounding the pavement, thinking like, if somebody reads my book, then they're going to like it, and maybe they'll tell somebody else. Finally, I think in the end of November, it was selected as a New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year. And so, which means it was of the 5 books, 5 novels, it was chosen. And that's when my publisher said, you know what, we're going to put this in paperback early. And then people said, you know what, we are going to spend $16.99 for a book, but we're not going to spend $27.99 for a book that has a foreign title, a foreign sounding name, and an abstract cover. Right? That's 3 doors of foreignness that people just couldn't get through. So then I needed to advocate and explain my work, and I needed to and then also design the book cover. So the paperback, when it came out, they sent me several covers, and I was like, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. And I love my initial cover. And then I went to a cafe, and I saw a Japanese woman in a kimono, and in the kimono there was a landscape. So I took a picture of that, and I sent it to the designer, the publisher, saying, I want you to do this with a hanbok, with a Korean traditional outfit. And I want you to put the story in the landscape in her skirt. So that's how involved I was. And I'm not saying that this is what all authors should do, but if people ask me, well, how did your book do so well? It's because your publisher must have spent all this energy. And I was like, my publisher did everything they did for a good book, what they could do. But I did as much as I possibly could because I was so afraid of not having like a roof over my head. And I don't know how people feel about what they believe in, but I really believe in my work. I'm very proud of my work, and I believe that if people read it, they will tell other people. And if I didn't have that sense of inviolable confidence, which is really rare for a writer, it really is. So, and I think it comes to that point because I work on my books for such a long time that by the time I send it to the world, I feel really like, this is it. This is it. And if you don't like it, well, I don't know, but I think you might like it if you give it a shot. But I had to sell my book. Like, I had to hand sell my book.
I think Min touches on the,
Sorry, Roxanne, were you? No, okay, go ahead, Eric. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say that Min touches on the single most important factor in the marketing of any book. And it's not a rave review in the New York Times. It's not an ad all over the place. It's not social media. It is simple word of mouth. And word of mouth is something that can be generated sometimes by publishers, but it is often generated mostly by authors and their friends.
And how does that, like when we talk about those factors that differentially impact authors of color, authors for excluded communities. You know, for you, is that one of them, in that maybe they don't have the same networks or the free time that it takes to go and do 1,000 events? You know, or are there ways of stimulating that word of mouth that should be part of the kind of strategies that we talk about?
Yeah, I think that authors who happen to be published by major companies, especially I would say many an author of color I've met, they become seduced by the so-called power of major publishers, and they expect success to issue from the efforts of major publishers, and that rarely is a happy story. But dependence on oneself, which is something I encourage most writers to do in the publication of their books, is for me the way to go, because you're not limited by what the publisher wants to or intends to do for your book.
Well, I mean, I think this is where we get into the issue of how do we actually diversify publishing, because like Min, the reason I was able to sell so many books is because from 2014 till 2020, I was basically on the road every week. I was never home. I was constantly on the road. But I could do it because I teach, and I could build my classes around touring and so on. And I could do that because I had the means and because I don't have children and all kinds of other factors. So like you really, I mean, this is where intersectionality comes in, but it requires a certain level of privilege to be able to be on the road all the time. And so when we talk about like how do writers of color make it, we have to think about how do we level the playing field so that writers can put in that face time that really does sell books. And for me, events really do help sell books, and word of mouth sells books. But you know, a lot of times publicists will say, I don't know how to sell this book, or they have the Highlander mentality of there can be only one. And so, you know, they're not going to Essence Fest, for example, and they're not doing all kinds of other things. I remember when I was touring Bad Feminist, I went to Milwaukee, and I can't remember the name of the bookstore there, but it's incredible. And the guy named Daniel runs it, and he put signs up in black churches. And so I had black people at a reading for, back then, that was a rarity. And it was because he had the wherewithal to think outside the box and do that. And it's really that simple. It's not rocket science, and people of color are not mysterious angels that cannot be understood. We're not. I know that, you know, it's sexy to think that, but, you know, like so many of the answers to these questions are really, really simple. And we have to find ways to encourage the people that run publishing to stop thinking that because they've read How to Be an Anti-Racist that they have figured everything out. Like, go and spend some time with people of color. Go to Harlem and go to Chinatown and like leave your comfort zones and really interact with people of color. And also make sure that you're not only interacting with wealthy people of color, because those people are not necessarily, and I hold myself in this, not necessarily indicative of what communities actually need and want. When you look at what's really selling, like, Colleen Hoover, girl. I mean, what the fuck? It's just, I read one of those books because my students told me to, and, well, I also think you have to meet readers where they're at. Like, why are those books selling so well? And I couldn't tell you, but they're clearly reading well. And so we also have to change our attitudes towards what people want to read, because what people want to read and what we want to sell them are two very different things. And so there are just lots of easy answers, but we have to overcome, I think, a lot of our deeply held ideals in order to avail ourselves of those answers.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I want to open it up to the audience. There are mics that are coming around. And so if you'd like to ask a question, I see one hand here in the second row. So let's start over here, and then we'll go to the lady in the black sweater.
My name is Parrish. I'm a member of the HarperCollins Union. We've been on strike for 24 days. A lot of what things you're talking about is a lot of coalition building and kind of working together across communities. I wonder if you speak more to that in your own.
It's about community building and working across communities.
I just have one thing to say that is related to that subject. After listening to Min and Roxanne both talk about the work they've done to build their audiences, and one of the reasons that they have both been huge successes is because they are appealing to a diverse audience. But one of the things that means is precisely that they are appealing to audiences across racial lines, across gender lines, and I think that is a piece of it. I would like to see more white people reading writers of color. I would also like, Min has referred a couple of times to reading the classics and things, and I would like there to be a strong sense that the entire American literary tradition and global literary tradition belongs to everybody, that it belongs to all readers. So I think that's a big piece of it too. I go back to Leon Forrest, who I was talking about before, and I'm reading this book, and I'm reading about the book, and I'm reading some interviews, and he said a couple of interesting things. One thing he said is, I did not set out to write the great Black American novel, I set out to write the great American novel. And he was influenced by Ellison, among others, but he also named his great influences as the 19th century Russians. And he talked about how the questions that Dostoevsky was dealing with about a particularist Slavic tradition and a westernizing, sort of universalizing force, and what it means for those things to come into contact with each other, resonated very, very deeply with him as a Black man negotiating these sort of spheres of universalized culture. So I think I think that's one thing, is that we should all think about all of this belonging to all of us.
Okay, the black sweater, and then after that we'll go to the woman in the back under the portraits. Thanks.
I'm black sweater. Sarah Ardell.
Hi, Sarah.
So I'm a poet. Speaking of the poetry world, I have a great publisher. I'm with Knopf. I have absolutely wonderful publishers who have no complaints. But I can't sell. But this is a question I have. I erroneously, stupidly thought that American literature was diversify. And the reason I have that impression is that good friends of mine, who are people of color, have won wonderful prizes, like Tracy Smith, who's been poet laureate, like DJ Sasaji, who has the Pulitzer, Jericho Brown, who had the Pulitzer. My friend Rachel Griffiths has a huge following. Kevin Young is enormously influential. That's the poetry world. What's your relationship? Why am I wrong?
Okay. Thank you.
Well, you can name them. As long as you can name them, then it's not enough. And just because a few Black people win prizes doesn't mean that it's diverse. It means that a few Black people have worked really, really hard and have been exceptional in every possible way to rise through all of these infrastructural and systemic barriers to be noticed and recognized. And it's relatively recent that these prize winnings have happened and things like that. Like Min, I have sat on committees. I'm the chair of the Pulitzer Committee for Nonfiction this year. And when you see how the prize sausage is made, it kills your soul. Not necessarily in a bad way, but, you know, prizes are not an indication of diversity. They are an indication of excellence and luck and being in the right place at the right time. But when poetry is truly diverse, we will be able to name amazing poets who haven't won prizes, but who are doing excellent work. We will be able to look at a list on Knopf or Penguin Poets, which I will say poetry is getting better, and see so much diversity that we no longer have to point it out. As long as we can point it out, we have a long way to go.
I think Errol had a comment as well.
Just about every author you mentioned was Black. The inclusion of Black writers as prize winners does not bespeak diversity, if only because the rest of America is not included, okay? So until we reach this, excuse me? Yeah, those are your friends. But what I'm suggesting is that until we are in a situation where we can't, as Roxanne say, name individuals who excel, until there is such a wide movement of Hispanics, of Jews, of Muslims, et cetera, then we shouldn't be talking about diversity. We're talking about, you know, de minimis winners of prizes.
Okay, Sabir has a person with a question next to him.
Hi. I don't know where to go after those impeccable and graceful responses, so thank you for that. And I have a question I'd really like to direct at Errol, but I'd love whoever else would like to weigh in, because I think Roxanne also have thought about this. My name's Kelly Goff, and I started in politics, moved to publish my first book, which I think sold 12 copies, including the 11 my mom bought. And because of a glutton for punishment, I then moved into journalism and now work primarily as a screenwriter in Hollywood. And I say all that because you might have heard that there are a lot of the same issues there, which tees up my question. When I was working, and I promise you I'm going to ask you, Errol, but I want to just tee this up with some data. When I was working full-time as a journalist, and one of the things I wrote about was lack of diversity in fashion. And 10 years ago, when a Black woman made the cover of Vogue, it still made international news, because that's how rare it was. And what was said by certain people in the fashion industry out loud is, well, that's because the magazine sales go down, right? Even though they weren't comparing it to the white women who also didn't sell well that year, right? Because there are a lot of white celebrities who didn't sell well. And I remember one of the things I heard from a prominent Black model I spoke to was, a lot of it starts at the agencies, because she was at an agency that was small, represented 100 Black models. I mean, when it represented 100 models, only one of them was Black. So that meant starting at the go-sees for runway shows, as they call them, maybe there'd be 2 Black models for the designers to choose from. Suzanne's telling me to wrap it up, so I will.
Just the quiet, yeah. It's great to see you, Kelly. I want to hear your question.
And so this is the point. It's not a comment, because this actually does tee up the question, is what I've seen across the board, whether it's broadcast journalism, Hollywood, publishing, and to your point, Suzanne, about the music industry, is if there aren't people in the key roles we don't think of, it doesn't matter. So my question, bringing it back to Errol, is music industry I know nothing about, but I can name Sylvia Rhone and Berry Gordy. I can't name that in publishing. And so when Errol was speaking and Roxanne was speaking, the main question I was wondering is, why is it that I, for every project I've worked on in Hollywood or books, has to hire the Black publicist? Why isn't there a Black person in a high-ranking role in marketing at a publishing house? And why isn't that who's being considered to run a publishing house? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I'm going to add a little overlay, which is there have been a number of really prominent, high-level appointments of editors and publishers of color, and would love to hear, to Kelly's point, sort of how much difference you see as a result of that, and why or why not?
because of the one nigger syndrome, okay? The notion that one black person should shoulder the burden that has not been carried by the white generality, okay? No black person entering into a position of responsibility and power in publishing can change the game, because the game is beyond them. So I don't see these appointments as a step forward. I see these appointments, for the most part, as exercises in cosmetics.
I mean,
we also, we're talking about an industry where it might be harder to imagine a person of color leading one of the top 5 firms. It's easier to become a person of color and become president of the United States.
Just hold on a second there. I think some of the other panelists want to come in response to.
I also want to comment on the fact that when you mentioned all those different industries, what you were really talking about is soft culture and soft power. And I speak about it intentionally because right now South Korea, in the past, I guess I want to say 30 years, has been working very actively as a country to sell soft power abroad and globally. And you are feeling the effect of it. It is not an accident that you guys know Korean. And I just wanted to say that having gone to an elite college, a highly selective college, and having been this close to people who really care about this stuff, it's no different than political power. It's no different than financial power. It's really, really valuable power. And they don't want to give it up. And they're going to fight tooth and nail to keep it. And I don't blame them. The hours are great in publishing. The money isn't great, but the hours are really great. And the prestige is very, very high. And the same thing is in Hollywood, the same thing is in fashion. Like, you can't even enter into those. Like, I have research assistants from very elite universities who are so freaking smart, it's crazy. And they cannot break into fashion, publishing, Hollywood, any of those things, because they don't know somebody. And even if they did know somebody, they have to get in line because somebody else is more important than you. Some other client is more important than you. And they're all like saying, I have to work for free for 2-3 years. And I'm thinking, and how in the world can you do that? But it's power. It's naked power. And actually, this is the reason why I'm actually agreed to be on this panel is because we are the source of culture. Books are the source of culture. And it's the most scalable source of culture since the beginning of the printed word, right? And this is the reason why we can go back to Leon Forster, because he left a document. He left a document, so even if he's not here, the book is still here, so we can decide what we're going to do with it. Kindred is just being made into television now, after 40-something years, right? And we don't know what's going to happen to it. I haven't seen it. But all I know is I love Octavia Butler. I stand with her. But I think what we're really talking about is, are they going to give power away? Because let's just think about this. Let's say all of us somehow change the world and find all these readers, and we could prove that there is a market for this incredible work that we do as people of color and also as outsiders, whatever your group is, that we haven't been traditionally published. Would they give that power away? I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, question in the back. Thank you.
Hello. Full disclosure, I know Linda, but
sorry, it's a little hard to hear you. So
I said I knew Mitch, and I just wanted to go back to something that was said earlier about parenting and this idea of that as work and the degree to which the masterpiece of your child took a lot of your time before you could create the masterpiece of your book. And I think we want to think about what that means for women as writers who are parents. But that's my question. My question is about intellectual power and intellectual capital. And I'm an anthropologist. I was intrigued by your question about music and the Black community. And one of the things that we have in the Black community is a sense of authority over music as culture. While we value deeply intellectual culture in Black communities, we value books. Go to a Black Women's Book Club, and if you want to meet people who really care about literature. So we value intellectual culture, but publishing doesn't value the intellectual cultures of communities of color. And so how do we negotiate that separation between the fact that we have all of these communities of color in which we have voracious and intelligent and committed readers, and we have an industry whose idea of intellectual work is very white and very male. Because that gatekeeping, I think, is at the center of this tension, the center of why publishing works so differently from music. So that's kind of my question.
Well, I think this is where hiring diversely comes in, because most of publishing doesn't know about the very robust book club culture in Black communities. The people that have been best to me over the course of my career are the members of a book club called Go On Girl that has a great many chapters. The reason that An Untamed State sold as well as it did for a first novel was because of Go On Girl. And I remain grateful to them to this day. And so you need people who know that these intellectual communities exist and understand their value, who can also make decisions so that you don't have to prove to Jonathan over there that these communities matter, who have the ability to say, I know these communities matter, I don't have to prove it to anyone, and so how do we market to them? How do we get them to sign on? And so it really does come down to who's in the room, and more importantly, who's the decision maker, because we could say that publishing has started to hire more diversely, but it's at entry-level positions. And that's not enough. And we can name like Lisa Lucas, who's doing great work at Pantheon. She's already left, but Dana Canady at Simon & Schuster, and there have been a couple other significant hires. But it's going to require that, and recognizing that we shouldn't have to prove that these are intellectual communities and that they're just as valuable as the intellectual communities that publishing tends to look to. Like, we could advertise in Essence perhaps instead of the New Yorker. Like, I love the New Yorker, and I'm grateful that my publisher will put ads in there. But like, also, like, you know, there are a lot of readers who are checking out Essence. Ebony's no longer publishing, but, you know, and other Black publications. So it's things like that.
Okay, over here in the back, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for your quick question. There's a field of economics who talks about celebrity economics, and he talks about we're going to take all markets, like in sports and media, TV, acting. How do you look into that idea? Because I think that's what's happening here. A few individuals are making all the money, the rest are not, and that I think will discourage people from coming in. And also, how do you motivate the younger generation to read with all the social media and cell phones and everything? I don't see people reading in the library, so I don't know if you have any answer for that. Thank you.
No. I think it is a sort of an underlying undercurrent here is how reading habits are changing, will change. You know, if we want to think about diversification, you know, how do we think about not what that looks like today or in the past, but in the future?
Well, I'll say again, you have to meet readers where they are, and also you have to disabuse yourself of the notion that people are reading less. My dissertation happens to be kind of on this subject, and there was a great study that was done at Stanford about, well, I'm old, but about 16 or 17 years ago now, and young people are reading all kinds of things. They're reading Discord forums, and they're reading on Reddit and all of these other places, and because like a lot of us are entrenched in what we think of as literature or as good writing, we're not going to look at those things and value them as writing. And I'm not going to suggest that like we should like make a novel as a Reddit forum, though. I mean, that's a free idea if you have the time. You know, it's really, I think, about recognizing that reading might look different, but people will still sit and read things that they love. And I think a lot of it is that we have to recognize that we have to stop being snobby about genre and looking down on genre. Like these books in genre may not be our particular tastes, but that's kind of what people want to read. And it doesn't mean we don't publish literary fiction or poetry or things like that, but like when you look at the number of people that read sci-fi and fantasy, like my niece who is 10 is not only reading a fantasy novel right now, she is writing one and in a little notebook, and she's like drawing pictures with it. And so people will read when they read things they want, and they're not told that there's something less than about what they're reading. And so I think we have to be less asshole-ish.
Full circle. Okay, here. Okay, this, take two.
I'm one of those people who raised my hand. I don't think it's going to happen, but every time someone brings up the reader, I get really excited because as someone who works in publishing, like I listen to so many of these forums, and I'm like, yeah. It's not the power in the room; it's the power of people outside of the room who are going to spend their money to buy the books. That's what will create change. And these are businesses, right? And that's why I loved what you said, Ms. Lee, about like you did a reading and people came to the reading and they said, I've never been to a reading before. You know, and it's about like inviting the readers in. So like that's for me, I'm like, how do we, you know, maybe in publishing it's about like authors like you coming and telling us what your readers want and us listening to you and actually acting on that. Like, you listen to our authors when they say we want to go to Ask and Sense, or like when they say my cover is wrong, but like, how else do we, like in any of these rules, invite the readers in? Like, come to this reading, this is your space. Buy this book, because this book is for you, actually.
I think that we often ignore readers. And also, I think we're not developing readers. And I think that what you're saying and what this gentleman asked right before you is really important is how do we make, I think Roxanne's absolutely true because there are many, many readers, but very often we're missing each other. And then also there are certain people who think that reading is not for them, or reading books may not be for them, or there are certain audiences that are there are certain books that are so intimidating, therefore they feel excluded from that conversation. And I think one of the things that I think about a great deal is trying to respect the reader in the same way that I want to be respected. And I know that all of us authors want a lot of things. We want a lot of things. And that's okay. I don't want to shame anybody for wanting the moon and the stars and the heavens. Like, if you want it, that's great. You're going to have to want, your ambition's going to have to be enormous because the task in front of you is so difficult. And one of the things I have to say is that the marketing of a book, the window in publishing is absurd. It's absurd. Like to give 2 weeks or 3 weeks or even a month for a book to get out there when in fact most people they might even buy a book but they might not read it, right? And so do you really just care about the sales of a book, or do you care about the fact that a book will be cherished and they'll be passed along or have word of mouth? And sometimes I tell my audiences, do you know how much I make when I sell a book? And I tell them, well, actually for a hardcover, maybe like $2.50. And for a paperback, a little bit over $1. For an ebook, if there is an ebook, I think it's like maybe $1.50, I think. And I tell them, like I literally tell my audience this, and they look at me like, oh my gosh, how do you possibly, but I'm kind of a socialist, so I think it's important for people to have information. And so I said, well, if there's 200 of you in this room, and I sell 15 copies, I basically made $20. And I don't say this to shame them, I'm just telling them this is what is going on. So when everybody believes that content should be free, that my time should be free, I want you to say that you don't respect me and you don't respect yourself. I know, but I'm an old lady and I'm a college professor and I don't have any problems like saying this stuff, but I say it because in a way I'm respecting the reader. And when you explain things to readers, the actual mechanics of this, it's not magic fairy dust, and I did this little wand and all of a sudden that book is the anointed one. Because I think that's like a magical wish. It's a childish wish to think that somehow I'll be anointed, and then that means that you will be discovered and millions of books are going to sell. I've actually never seen that. I recently introduced, and I spent way too much time introducing The Great Gatsby for Penguin Classics. And I agreed to do it because I thought they're never going to ask another Korean American woman, so I guess I better do it. And I wrote it, and I spent 3 months doing it, and I got paid $2,500 to do it. And I spent all that money buying secondary sources from like 8 books. Because I was like, I'm going to learn fucking Fitzgerald. And I had 100 footnotes in this introduction, which is not what I should have done. But if you get a chance to look at this thing, and if you guys are at Penguin Random House somewhere, someone will give you a copy. I know. I'm slightly a socialist. But all I wanted to say is that his trajectory for The Great Gatsby was really pathetic. In his lifetime, he didn't sell his first run. He didn't. Like by accident, like almost like after he was dead, his book was put into a tiny book for soldiers during the war. And a lot of soldiers read the book. And then later on they came back and they're like, oh yeah, that Gatsby thing, that was pretty good. And then it started to sell again. But he never in his lifetime experienced the success that Gatsby has today.
The theme is that the book has to be shrunk, because that's Errol, that's Faulkner, and that's Fitzgerald.
Can I just jump in and just add one other thing?
Sure.
Yeah, because Min spoke about finding the reader who really cherishes the book. And sometimes when we talk about low sales numbers, we use these examples of, a Cormac McCarthy or a Melville or a Toni Morrison or Fitzgerald. And then later in their careers, they find the huge audience, and that somehow justifies it. But I want to speak up for the books that are great even though they never find the audience. And indeed, the books that are not ever going to find, I keep coming back to Leanne Forrest, but just like an 1,100-page modernist novel, it is not that people aren't doing it right to launch that into a mass audience, but the people who love that thing, that is, I'm the kind of reader who books like that are what makes life worth living for me. Truly, it is such a huge part of just like the day-to-day meaning of my life, and I think that's just an important thing. It's like you want to find readers, but you want to find, like, if you can find the handful of readers for whom this is going to be one of the 20 most important things that ever happened in their lives is that they read this book.
Quality
And I've had books that strike me in that way, that I can count them. My relationship with certain books are among the most important relationships in my life. So I would love that all the points about expanding audience. That's like I want everybody to have that, but I also want us to appreciate books that are never going to have a mass audience, and not to sort of just tell certain stories where someone who didn't have a mass audience found it later, and then that justifies it. But just say that if Cormac McCarthy had written Blood Meridian and then been hit by a truck, that book would be an amazing, amazing, amazing book. And he didn't need to write The Road in order to justify that book.
Hi, thanks so much. Shall do with Kensington Publishing, and I work specifically with our imprint, PR, and communications in general, so marketing the whole shebang. Over the past few years, we've been working really hard to bring in authors from all sorts of backgrounds, regardless of what their voice may be. It's a specific initiative that we've been doing, and Kensington as a whole, since the 70s, has been working specifically to get authors from diverse backgrounds, and we're continuing that to this day. But a challenge that we often face is competition from bigger houses, because we're only in mid-size, we're not one of the big five, in capturing those diverse voices, those authors with kind of the different backgrounds, the different stories that we want to put out there more and more. What can we as a publishing house do to entice writers like you? Even though we aren't fancy, we aren't big, we have some word of mouth, and very often we have authors who come from bigger houses and then come to us with their next book and explain how much of a more pleasant experience it's been being with us compared to bigger houses. But on the front line, it's very difficult to compete with the prestige of a big fancy publishing house that everyone kind of knows. So is there anything that we can do as a house dedicated to
highlighting diverse voices to get those voices?
Thank you.
I think that's a really good question. I think that maybe the answer is that you don't compete. And instead, you look for the authors who are willing to take a chance. I mean, there are absolutely going to be diverse authors who are willing to take a chance on a smaller press. My fiction will hopefully always be published at Grove Atlantic. My nonfiction's at HarperCollins, but I'm not taking my fiction there. Because I like working with a smaller house. I could probably call up anyone at Grove to ask a question. And so you have to highlight what you can offer that no one else can, including the individuals, like, hey, here's Marcia, and here's what she does, and here's the kind of access, here's how we're gonna work with you. We may not be able to offer you a lot of money up front, but you probably, even though it's tempting, and I always want writers to get money, so if you can get a big advance, please get a big advance. But I can tell you that low advances hurt in the beginning. They do. You get your little feelings really hurt, but they really pay off in the long run because you earn out, and it makes it easier to sell your second and third and fourth book. And so you can talk about some of those intangibles that may not seem super sexy, but you will find the right partners. And in terms of like other authors like us, I mean, maybe just ask. So often people don't ask because they assume they're out of the game already, but you'd be surprised by how many authors, I'm not referring to myself, this is not a thing, but who are unhappy with their publishers and are looking for something different. So also try that.
Okay, we're going to wrap in a minute. I just want to, does anyone, any other closing comments in response to that or anything else from our panel? Okay. Well, in that case, I want to thank you all for a riveting conversation. I want to thank our audience for joining us. I want to thank Penguin Random House for hosting us here. I want to recognize a couple of other members of the Penn leadership. Clarice Rosada Sharif is here, who is our Senior Director, Chief Program Officer for Literary Programs, and her Deputy, Sabir Sultan, who's been handy with the mic. This is our, some of our key literary programs teams, so good people to know. And I want to encourage all of you who've come out tonight, if you're not a member of PEN America, please join our organization. We need your voices within our organization. We need you to stand with us in our activism, to join us at our literary awards, at our PEN World Voices Festival, which will hold this spring, and refer your friends for membership. Bring them to our readings, our events, our conversations to learn what it's all about, and lend your voices with us together. If you want to continue the conversation over a drink, we're going to repair to McGee's Pub when you exit the lobby. Take a right on Broadway and another right onto 55th Street, and we'll be on the second floor. Thank you all for coming and for your continued commitment to the work that PEN America does.